All right, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Swinko from Southern Tier West, and welcome to our webinar on Introduction to National Flood Insurance Program. Today's host is Southern Tier West, Sarah Swinko and Sarah Fiersdorf. And our presenter today is Brianna Worley, who I'll introduce in a minute. But before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping. So next slide, please. So please stay muted at all times. I believe on our end, we have it so everyone is muted, but you are able to interact with the speaker and us through the chat box. The chat box can be found at the bottom, and also the Q&A. So you can put questions in either the chat or Q&A, and we will get back to those at the end of the webinar. So the first hour, we'll have a presentation, and the last half hour, we will have our Q&A. So to receive credit, you have to be attending the webinar the entire time. So I mentioned, it's an hour and a half class. Be here, by 1 or 15 minutes after the start time, and then it'll be until about 2:30. So just being present the whole entire time. You will want to respond to the polls. So there will be a few polls that you need to answer questions to. It doesn't matter if it's, right or wrong. It's just whether you're here. And then for CEOs, please email Brianna or Southern Tier West your ID number to receive credit. For planning and zoning, Sarah Fiersdorf will send a certificate of attendance to sign in and hand to your board. But if you do not receive an email from Sarah, please contact her and let her know. And here's our contact information in case you need it. So today our presenter is Brianna Worley. She is a certified floodplain manager and environmental program specialist with the Division of Water at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. She assists communities with New York State to implement standards and requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program through technical assistance, community visits, and trainings. Brianna is the primary contact for communities in New York State DEC regions 7, 8, and 9. So Brianna, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah. So good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started on today's webinar. It should take us the full hour to get through all of the material. So like Sarah mentioned, this course is approved for in-service training credit for code enforcement officials. It has already gone for that pre-approval with Department of State. So if you are interested in getting continuing education credit as a code enforcement officer, please submit your full name and training ID number to either myself or Southern Tier West. And this course is good for 1 hour on topic 2, the Uniform Code. And this is the course number in case you need it. So for the floodplain management program at DEC, we have colleagues that work in central office in Albany. That we have our state NFIP coordinator, who is Kelly Higgins-Roche. We have Bailey Sawyer, who helps cover DEC regions 1 through 4. Brad Wenskowski helps with DEC regions 5 and 6, and Jeff Golick assists with any engineering or technical questions related to no-rise analysis or encroachment reviews. I work out of what's called the Western Flood Hub, which covers DEC regions 7, 8, and 9, and is located in our Region 8 office in Avon. If you're ever not sure who to contact and you have a question related to floodplain management, you can always email us at floodplain@dec.ny.gov. In each of the regions, there is also staff within the Division of Water that works part-time within this program. So if you're located within DEC Region 8, you can contact either Jonathan Tamargo or Brad Chafee. If you're located in DEC Region 9, you can contact Mandy O'Hare, who works out of our Buffalo office. So this is an overview of what we're going to cover today and all of the topics. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to place them in the chat or the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and I will get to those at the end. So starting off with a little bit of the background for the National Flood Insurance Program. So the program was established by the Federal Flood Disaster Act of 1968. So prior to the formation of the National Flood Insurance Program, federal actions related to flooding was primarily, more structural measures, thinking like constructing levees and dams. And there was a significant amount of federal expenses related to dealing with these larger flooding events. So despite these more structural measures, we did not see a reduction in the loss of life or property due to flooding. So the federal government decided to establish a process through the National Flood Insurance Program that uses an insurance component and local regulations to sort of address some of these concerns. So the initial start of the program was identifying where these flood-prone areas are within the U.S., establishing these flood risk zones, and within those areas where these regulations apply, require any new or substantially improved buildings within these high-risk areas to be constructed in a way that would minimize flood damages, and then transfer cost of private property flood losses to the from the taxpayer to private property owners who own property within that high-risk area. So in order to accomplish these goals, I already mentioned that you require any new construction and substantial improvements to be constructed in a way that is flood resistant. We want to guide any future development, away from these flood hazard areas or high risk zones. Transferring the flood loss costs from the general taxpayers to property owners through flood insurance, and then prohibiting development within the most high-risk areas, which are the floodways or regulatory floodways, and I will discuss those in more detail later on in the presentation. So moving on to roles and responsibilities. At the federal level, FEMA is the agency that is responsible for the administration of the National Flood Insurance Program. So they develop the maps that the regulations are based on. They also provide flood insurance. They set the minimum building codes and standards within those areas. They determine community compliance, and then they also have enforcement authority for this program. The Army Corps of Engineers sometimes gets involved within this program as they can develop flood studies to support the development of regulatory mapping, and they also provide some other floodplain management related services as well. So at the state level, DEC is designated as the state coordinating agency for the National Flood Insurance Program. So we contract with FEMA to assess community compliance and then work with communities on compliance issues. We provide technical assistance as well as developing a state model ordinance for flood damage prevention. Similar to like the assessing of community compliance, that's through those community assistance visits or community assistance contacts where either the state or FEMA will come out and meet with the community to talk about the requirements of the program and the local administration. Department of State gets involved with this as they establish the building codes for the state, which incorporate most of the floodplain management requirements, at least for structures. So most of the floodplain management requirements for buildings has been incorporated into the Uniform Code since 2007. Dishes or the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services is our state hazard mitigation office, and they administer those federal disaster grants and assist with all county hazard mitigation plans. So at the local level, as a home rule state, it is the local municipality with land use authority that has the responsibility for implementing the floodplain management regulations. So each community that's participating in the NFIP has a local flood damage prevention ordinance, which designates what regulations apply within those high-risk areas. And then it is the local community's responsibility to ensure all development is compliant with their local law, as well as additional state or federal requirements for that. So DEC does not look at floodplain compliance during review of other DEC permits. So even though we are the state coordinating agency, we do not have direct permitting authority when it comes to floodplain management. So those programs and those regulatory standards are not reviewed during other DEC permitting programs. So if there's a wetland permit or a protection of waters permit that's within the department, they're not going to be considering the floodplain management requirements as part of that review. So that leads me to our first poll question. So poll question number 1 is going to be a true or a false. So the DEC permit unit considers local floodplain regulations and NFIP requirements during the review of all permit applications. Okay. So we'll just give it a little bit for responses to come in. Okay, so wrapping up, if you haven't submitted a response to the question, it's okay. It doesn't have to be correct, but you do have to respond if you're looking for continuing education credit for this class. So I did just cover this, and the answer here is going to be false. So DEC does not consider local floodplain regulations during the review of permit applications. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some important definitions. So each of these are going to be covered in this section. I've also included the sections here for where you can find these definitions within the building code as well as the federal regulations. Okay. So the definition of development for floodplain management purposes is really broad. It essentially means any man-made change to the floodplain. So that's including, but not limited to, buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavating, storage of equipment or materials. All of that is considered development under the floodplain management regulations and would require a local floodplain development permit. So the special flood hazard area is what's referred to as that high risk area or the floodplain. So it's the land within a community that's subject to a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year. The zones on your maps are going to start with an A or a V. So that's a quick way to know whether it's within the 100-year floodplain. So the base flood, or previously referred to as the 100-year flood, is the flood having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. So we really try to get away from using that term 100-year flood because it gives that misperception that it's something that's only going to happen once every 100 years. But this graphic on the slide shows that if you have a structure, so say your home is within that 100-year floodplain, and you have a mortgage on your property. Most mortgage terms are for a 30-year period. Over that 30-year mortgage period, you would have a 26% chance of flooding. So much greater than one once every 100 years. So the floodway is an area within the floodplain that is the channel of the river, creek, or other watercourse and the adjacent land areas that must be reserved in order to discharge that base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than like any increase in New York State. So that's 0.00 foot rise. And I'm going to show you how that is modeled and shown on the map. So this is showing a cross section of a stream. You can see where the natural channel is here. And this would be the limits of that 100-year or 1% annual chance floodplain. So when they're determining where the limits of the floodway are going to be, they model essentially encroachments or fill being placed on the side, on either side of the stream until it results in a 1 foot surcharge at any of those modeled cross sections. Once that 1 foot is reached at any of those cross sections, that designates where the limit of the floodway is. So essentially, all development is prohibited within the floodway unless you can have that engineering analysis completed that demonstrates that that development will result in a 0.00 foot rise. So the lowest floor for structures means the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including a basement, an unfinished or flood resistant enclosure that's used solely for limited storage, access, or parking. That's not a basement would not be considered a building's lowest floor, provided that that enclosure is built so that it meets certain requirements. So a basement is defined as any subgrade space. So it would be an area of a building that's floor is subgrade on all sides. So it doesn't matter what the depth of that is. If it's below grade on all 4 sides, under the NFIP, it's considered a basement. So a walkout basement or a basement where one side is equal to the outside grade would not be considered a basement, provided that there are no utilities within that space or they're properly elevated and that it's constructed with flood resistant materials. So basements are prohibited on all new structures or substantially improved structures within the floodplain. Okay, so these are going to give a couple examples of where that lowest floor would be based on different construction types. So showing a single-story slab on grade home, the lowest floor would be the top of the slab. A house with a basement, the lowest floor would be considered the basement slab. For mobile homes, if they have vinyl or aluminum skirting, meaning that it's not hard, structural skirting around the building, then the lowest floor would be the bottom of the frame. Okay. So this is a 2-story structure that's elevated on a crawl space foundation. So as long as that crawl space is not subgrade, meaning that the interior grade of that crawl space is at or above the exterior grade, and it has proper flood openings, as you can see in this picture, then the lowest floor for this structure would be the floor that you walk on. If this had a subgrade crawl space or it was not properly vented, then the lowest floor would be the bottom of that crawl space. So for a structure that's elevated on posts, piles, piers, or columns, the lowest floor elevation is going to be that lowest horizontal structural member. So keeping in mind that in New York State, any new or substantially improved structures are required to be elevated so that the lowest floor is at least 2 feet above that base flood elevation. And we'll get more into those development requirements later on. So substantial damage is damage of any origin sustained by a structure where the cost of restoring the structure to its before damaged condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the structure before the damage occurred. So one of the key things here is that it is damage of any origin. So it's not just flood damage. So this would apply to whether the structure, if there was a fire, an ice storm, a tree falling on it, any kind of damage where it would reach this 50% threshold. And if the structure is within the floodplain, then it's required to come into compliance with current flood damage resistant construction requirements, so elevated. Substantial improvement is very similar to substantial damage, but it includes any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement to a structure where the cost of that improvement equals or exceeds 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of that improvement. So an example I typically give here is that if you have a house that's located within the floodplain and it's currently worth $100,000 and the owner wants to put in, a new gourmet kitchen and a master ensuite, and that project is going to cost $60,000, then they would be required to bring that whole structure into compliance with the floodplain regulations. So elevating the 2 feet above the BFE. And the reason behind this requirement is that FEMA doesn't want people investing a lot of money into a property without first making it more resilient to flood damages. So when talking about substantial improvement, there are certain things that do not, that are not included in that determination. So any project for improvement of a structure to correct existing violations of state or local health, sanitary, or safety code. The key thing is that these have to be previously identified and cited by a local code enforcement official. And it would only be the minimum necessary to correct the violation. And then any alteration of a historic structure, provided that that alteration would not remove the structure from its historic designation. When we're talking about historic structures, that means they have to be designated on either a state or a federal registry to be considered historic. Okay, so on to our next poll question. So poll question number 2, a structure could be considered substantially damaged due to A, a fire, B, flood, C, tree falling on the structure, or D, all of the above. Okay, so if you haven't submitted your answer, go ahead and wrap it up. Okay, so the correct answer here is D, all of the above. So damage from any origin that would bring it over that 50% threshold. So I'm going to move on to talk about the flood insurance studies and the flood insurance rate maps. Okay, so this graphic is going to move through kind of the different iterations of maps, and we're going to discuss these in a little bit more detail in the following slides, but many communities in New York State are still using paper-based maps as their effective regulatory products. So the initial iteration of maps looked a little bit like this. It just had a flood-prone area designated with kind of a thick boundary line shown. Then we start to see mapping that looks a little bit more like this. That gray shaded area is designated as Zone A, and that's within the 100-year floodplain. So still, difficult to use, and some communities in New York still have this as their effective regulatory mapping. So this is a firm that has a detailed study, meaning that there are elevations established for this. So those numbered A zones have a base flood elevation determined. In some communities that have regulatory mapping that's dated from the late 70s to late 80s, they may have a floodway panel that's the floodway is designated on a separate panel. So that's something to look out for if you have two panels that look like they're in the same area, keeping in mind that it may be the floodway panel. On this panel, you can see the floodway is designated as that white area in the center of the stream. So the next iteration of mapping, we see that they have the floodway designated on the same panel, and that's shown as that crosshatched area in the center. In the early 2000s, they started to move towards map modernization to allow for mapping to be on a digital format. So it was produced so it can be over aerial imagery, which makes it a lot easier to identify whether a structure or particular development is located within the floodplain. And this is what the mapping looks for most communities now that are getting new updated studies. So the floodway is shown as that red hatched area in the center. This is also showing an area that is susceptible to both riverine and coastal flooding impacts. So those V zones shown on the left stands for velocity. Those are velocity zones are susceptible to wave action and wave run up as well. Okay. So on each map, there's going to be a map panel that has information that would be helpful. So on the left, you see older maps that were, prior to 2003, before we had map modernization, they were done on a community basis. So you would have a particular community listed showing where the area is mapped. It has the communities names and the community ID numbers. It includes the panel number as well as the effective map date. Once we move into map modernization and digital products, mapping is done on a county-wide basis instead of a community basis. So you would see a map panel number that would list potentially multiple communities that are on that particular panel. So when trying to read an older paper-based map, you first want to look at that map index to find which panel your property or development is going to be on. So you want to look for any major roads and waterways to kind of figure out where your location is, and then figure out which particular panel you are going to be looking at. Once you have the correct panel number, you can, navigate to your particular site location. If you're doing this from a computer, it can be really helpful to have like Google Maps or something similar open and have the firm panel open next to it so you can kind of see and navigate to the exact location. And then once you have your particular site identified, you can use FEMA's Map Service Center to create what's called a fermet, or a more localized area of the map to show your particular area. So some map features to look up for. This is showing an example. This is not what most firms look like, but this is an area that has a portion that has a detailed study, that zone AE, with base flood elevations established. It also has an approximate or unnumbered zone A at the top there, which means it's an area without base flood elevations established. The wavy lines on the map show approximate base flood elevations. In order to get the detailed base flood elevations, you would need to use the flood profiles in the back of the flood insurance study. So looking at a flood insurance study, this is a document that includes all of the engineering support for development of the mapping. So it has information for, how the maps were developed. It provides information related to flooding impacts within the community, how they determined the hydrology and the hydraulics for the study. So there can be a lot of really helpful information in there. The example on the left here shows what a flood insurance study looks like when it's done on a countywide basis and all of those communities listed. And on the right-hand side is a community based flood insurance study. It has like a yellowish tint to it. Even though we've updated the analysis, the graphic has stayed the same. So you see people being rescued in a boat. So some helpful sections that might be included within the flood insurance study is going to be for still water elevation. So if you have areas that are have flood impacts related to lakes or inland lakes, these can be really helpful tables to refer to. So this one shows what the flood elevations are for different, annual chance events. The one you would be looking at is that 1% annual chance event. So you can see for like this particular community, looking at, Cayuga Lake for the 1% annual chance, base flood elevation is going to be 385.8. There are also floodway data tables available, and these can be helpful because I highlighted some key sections here. So mean velocity at various cross sections along a stream can tell you whether or not it has a higher risk area. So anything that's greater than 5 feet per second is considered a dangerous area within the floodplain. So you can see for Angelica Creek in this community that the mean velocity is 11 feet per second at each of those cross sections. So that means that water is moving pretty fast. You can also find out what that regulatory base flood elevation is at that particular cross section. This can be helpful. It's not very often that development will fall right at a cross section, but if it does, then that can be used as the base flood elevation when determining how to properly elevate a structure. But when you are looking at what is the base flood elevation for your particular site, you can determine if you're close or within range, if it's if that number is within the base flood elevation shown between those two cross sections. So this is showing kind of how those relate. So on the right-hand side, you see an example of a flood insurance rate map. You can see where those cross sections line up to that floodway data table in the flood insurance study. So cross section E corresponds to that cross section E shown on Pinnacle Creek here. You can see what the mean velocity is at that cross section, which is 3.5 feet per second. And then the regulatory base flood elevation at that cross section, which is 569.5. So this is an idealized version of what a flood profile looks like, but I just use it for presentation purposes to give you an idea of what that might look like. So when you go to the back of the flood insurance study, you're going to see all of these flood profiles for those particular streams. So when you look at the stream, it's going to show you what those elevations are along that stream for the 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year event. So this is what you would need to use in order to find the detailed regulatory base flood elevation where there's a detailed riverine study. So in a riverine floodplain, you need to go to the flood profile in order to get the base flood elevation to the nearest 1/10 of a foot. So here's a real example of what that flood profile might look like. They also include structures such as culverts or bridges shown on this along that stream. So on the left side, you can see there's an area where flood elevation is determined by the backwater from the receiving water body. So these can be common in smaller tributary areas. But one of the things I also wanted to point out is that the culvert here, you can see the one that's closest in between cross sections E and F is going to be overtopped by several of those flood events, which is an indicator that that culvert is probably undersized. But the one that you see further downstream between cross sections C and D, that it can pass that 1% or 100-year flood event. So this is showing that same firm and where that flood profile lines up to those particular cross sections. I mentioned here highlighting that one culvert that is sized so that it can pass that 1% or 100-year event. So I did just want to mention some base level engineering and what that is and what it can be used for. So like I mentioned, there are many communities within New York State that are still using paper-based maps as their effective regulatory products. So base level engineering is a product that's available and can be used as best available information in communities that do not yet have digital mapping. So BLE is an engineering method that combines high resolution ground elevation data and modeling software to generate watershed-wide flood hazard information. So it makes it much more cost effective. It does not include any ground truthing or surveys to support that. It's using LiDAR data when modeling. As part of that BLE output, it does develop peak discharges and flood hazard data for various flood level events. And this data does not replace a community's flood insurance rate map, but it can be, and it won't affect any flood insurance rates or flood insurance purchase requirements, but it can be used as best available data. So in areas where there are not base flood elevations established, you can use this base level engineering mapping that does have base flood elevations established as regulatory. It can be used to support an application for a letter of map amendment or a letter of map revision based on fill to FEMA to remove a particular property or structure from the mapped floodplain in order to remove that mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. It can also be used for hazard mitigation planning, community planning, emergency management, as well as risk communication. So where to find map products? Each community should have a copy of their effective mapping on file. But if you cannot find the mapping, it is publicly available online through FEMA's Map Service Center. You can also contact a map specialist, and there's an 800 number there as well. If you are looking for more local support, again, they should be available at the local community offices. Sometimes county and regional planning offices will have copies of the maps, but you can also reach out to DEC, either our regional offices or me if you're looking for a map and you can't find it or wondering whether a proposed development would be within the floodplain. So our third polling question. So where do you get the base flood elevation or BFE to the nearest 1/10 of a foot in a riverine floodplain? So A, the flood insurance rate map or firm, the flood profile in the back of the flood insurance study, or C, the summary of still water elevations table, or D, USGS river gauges? Okay, if you want to go ahead and wrap up, if you haven't submitted the response yet. So the correct answer here is going to be B, the flood profile in the back of the flood insurance study. Okay, so I'm going to move on to development requirements within the floodplain. So for who's required to apply for and receive a local floodplain development permit. So this applies to all private developers and property owners, counties, cities, towns, or villages, school districts, and public improvement districts. So each of these entities would be required to apply to the local municipality for a local floodplain development permit. So school districts, while they do not need to get a building permit from the local code enforcement officer, if they are doing work within the floodplain, they do have to apply for a local floodplain development permit. Same thing applies for counties, thinking about like bridge or culvert replacements within the community. If it's within the floodplain, they need to apply for a local floodplain development permit from that municipality. So for residential construction, so any new or substantially improved residential construction is required to have the lowest floor, including a basement, elevated to or above the base flood elevation, plus 2 feet of freeboard in New York State. They're required to obtain and reasonably use data from a federal, state, or local source if there is no base flood elevation established on their current mapping. They are required, if there isn't an available base flood elevation through other sources, then they're required to have a professional develop that flood elevation by doing an analysis for that particular site. And then for any subdivisions or other type of development that's over 50 lots or over 5 acres, requires the applicant to provide flood elevation data and then build accordingly. So elevation options when talking about residential structures is that you can elevate on an open foundation, so posts, piles, columns, or piers. You can also elevate on a stem wall foundation, full story foundation walls, a crawl space, or a fill pad. And each of these technical bulletins that are shown on the right here provide additional guidance on each of those. So when I talked about the lowest floor determination, I mentioned openings or flood openings, flood vents. Those are required for any enclosures that are below that elevation, that design flood elevation, so that BFE plus 2 feet. Any enclosures below that elevation are required to have flood openings that automatically allow for the entry and exit of floodwaters. It requires that there be a minimum of 1 square inch per square foot of enclosed floor space, and that's measured along the exterior of the enclosure walls. They need to allow for the automatic entry and exit of floodwaters, so it can't have any permanent like closures or louvers that are in place that block that. They need to be at least 2 openings on 2 different walls, and the bottom of each opening must be within 12 inches of grade, either interior or exterior, whichever is higher. For non-residential structures, non-residential structures are also required to be elevated so that the lowest floor is at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. There is an exemption for areas where there is not a base flood elevation established, where it allows for the structure to be elevated at least 3 feet above the highest adjacent grade. For any development that would be over 50 lots or over 5 acres, it would still require that a flood elevation be developed as part of that project. So this is showing an example of how you would determine where that highest adjacent grade is and what that elevation requirement is. So if it's in an unnumbered A zone or approximate A zone where there are no base flood elevations established, non-residential structures can elevate 3 feet above that highest adjacent grade. So this image shows where that highest natural grade would be adjacent to the footprint of that proposed structure. And then you would add 3 feet to that to know where your lowest floor elevation would have to be. So this exemption is no longer allowed for residential structures. With the updated 2020 residential code, it now requires for all residential structures that they have a base flood elevation established. So this option is only available for non-residential structures, but that is likely to change with another update to the code. So non-residential structures also have the option to dry floodproof rather than elevating. So it requires that all new construction and substantial improvement have either lowest floor elevated or together with a tenant utility and sanitary facilities be designed so that the base, so that below the base flood elevation, that structure is essentially watertight and substantially impermeable to the passage of water. So that's when we're talking about floodproofing, or when you see floodproofing referenced in the regulations, it is referring to dry floodproofing. So that means making the structure impermeable to water. There is an entire technical bulletin specifically on dry floodproofing and how to meet those requirements. It does require design and certification by a professional engineer, and that dry floodproofing certification needs to be provided to the community. So all utilities, whether they're residential or non-residential, they should be elevated 2 feet above that base flood elevation, or designed and installed to prevent water from entering or accumulating within the components, and be resistant to any hydrostatic or hydrodynamic loads, including the effects of buoyancy. Any electrical wiring below that elevation would have to conform with the electrical code for wet locations. You want to elevate or waterproof any electric meters that would be replacement components, only applies when it's new construction or substantial improvement. And it cannot be mounted on or penetrate any breakaway walls. So storage tanks, any gas or liquid storage tank that's principally above ground is considered a structure under the regulations. So above ground tanks must be installed at or above the BFE plus the 2 foot of freeboard and properly anchored. Any underground storage tanks must be designed to resist any flotation, collapse, or lateral movement, including the effects of buoyancy. So accessory structures, things like garages, smaller sheds or storage buildings, pole barns, should be constructed in accordance with ASCE 24. Structures that are generally used for just storage or parking of vehicles, like those detached garages, they may have the option to wet floodproof rather than elevating. So some local laws do include the provision that allows for wet flood proofing of certain agricultural or accessory buildings. If your community does not have that provision included within your local law, it would require a local variance prior to allowing this type of development. And if you're not sure about this, you can always reach out to our office for additional guidance on that. So manufactured homes are required to be elevated so that the bottom of the frame is at least 2 feet above that base flood elevation. They're required to be anchored to a permanent foundation and have tie down requirements. If it has a solid foundation below that, then that area needs to be vented. And then if they are going to be placed within a regulatory floodway, that floodway encroachment analysis is still required. There is a guidance document specifically related to manufactured homes. FEMA's P85 is designated to protecting manufactured homes from floods and other hazards. So recreational vehicles. Recreational vehicles, if they are located within zone AE or A1 through 30, or AH, so any of those detailed A zones where there's base flood elevations established. Requirements for RVs are that they be on site for fewer than 180 days or be fully licensed and ready for highway use. They have to have quick disconnect utilities with no permanent attachments in order to meet that requirement. But if it meets either of those two requirements, a local permit is not required for an RV. If it can't meet those requirements, so it's going to be on site for more than 180 consecutive days, or it's not licensed and ready for highway use, then it would need to be elevated and anchored and meet all of the requirements of a manufactured home. So I did mention some of the technical bulletins that are available, but this is a list of all of the technical bulletins. So these have a wide range of topics that go more in depth on specifics, such as venting requirements, flood resistant materials, dry flood proofing, wet flood proofing. Each of these bulletins can help state and local officials interpret the NFIP regulations and can also be a useful resource to provide to homeowners, insurance agents, building professionals, or design professionals. So FEMA is in the process of updating these forms. So if you always just Google the NFIP technical bulletins or use the link available here, then you will know that you're getting the most up-to-date form. Okay, so on to our next poll question. So poll question number 4, this is a true or false. Non-residential structures have the option to dry floodproof instead of elevating. Okay, so it looks like that poll is launched. So I'm just going to give it another minute or so. Okay. So the correct answer here is true. So non-residential structures do have the option to dry floodproof rather than elevating. Okay. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about flood insurance to kind of close this out. So risk rating 2.0 or equity in action is what's referred to as FEMA's new flood insurance rating methodology. So this became effective for all policies starting April 1st of 2022. Some important takeaways for this change in insurance rating is that the firms and the base flood elevations which are still going to be used to determine mandatory purchase requirement. So it doesn't change the mandatory purchase requirements, and it doesn't change the requirements for floodplain management purposes. So the firms and the BFEs are not changing. Elevation certificates are no longer required for rating and insurance policy, but they are still required for floodplain management purposes. So any new or substantially improved structures within the floodplain should have an elevation certificate completed based on finished construction that demonstrates that that structure was properly elevated and is in compliance. So those should still be submitted for floodplain management, but they are not required for insurance rating. There are standard mitigation discounts that are available for elevating the machinery and equipment above the first floor, having proper flood openings, and elevating on an open foundation such as post piles or piers. So all of those mitigation discounts would be available whether you're within the mapped floodplain or not. And just as a reminder, so if your community is participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, that anyone within that community can purchase flood insurance. So flood insurance would be available to anybody. You do not have to be in the floodplain in order to purchase flood insurance. So local officials are not required to answer questions about insurance or make determinations for financial institutions. So if someone within your community has questions regarding flood insurance or their premium, you can always refer them to floodsmart.gov or their insurance agent. So floodsmart.gov is the official federal flood insurance resource. There's information available on that website on how to buy flood insurance, what is covered under a flood insurance policy, and then how to find a provider in your area. There's also information on the flood insurance advocate. If someone has concerns about their flood insurance premium or costs, they can always request assistance through that service as well. So one component about flood insurance that would be relevant to communities is ICC coverage, or increased cost of compliance coverage. So this is part of a flood insurance policy, which provides up to $30,000 to help cover costs to comply with state or community floodplain management laws or ordinances after a flood event in which a building has been declared substantially damaged or repetitively damaged. So this is available for residential and non-residential structures. It would provide up to $30,000 to either elevate, relocate, demolish, or dry flood proof if it's a non-residential structure. So in order to be eligible for an ICC claim, that building has to be located within that 100-year 1% annual chance floodplain, so in an A or a V zone. And the community is required to make a determination that that structure is either substantially damaged or they've adopted a provision within their local law for repetitive loss structures, and that that structure has been determined to be repetitively damaged. So the idea behind this is that if there's a structure that has been substantially damaged by flooding, that they would have money available to them on top of their claim to bring that structure into compliance to hopefully not experience that flood damage in the future. Okay. So last poll question here. So residential structures cannot use ICC funds to A, elevate, B, relocate, C, dry flood proof, or D, demolish. Okay, so the correct answer here is C, dry flood proofing. So dry flood proofing is only available for non-residential structures. So a residential structure could not use ICC funds to dry flood proof. Okay, so just to wrap things up here with some takeaways and resources. So benefits of proper enforcement for the floodplain management program is that you are going to have a safer, more resilient community. So providing support to your local code enforcement officer, who's oftentimes also designated as the local floodplain administrator responsible for administering this program is really important. You're going to have decreased flood damages within your community, lower flood insurance costs, and you're going to be able to maintain the property values as well. The goal of this program is really to have more resilient structures and infrastructure and reduce the cost on taxpayers for rebuilding efforts. So reducing the time spent mitigating flood after flood by, making sure that new development is built to this higher standard. I did want to share one of these tools that is available from DEC. One of the questions I receive most often from communities is how do they find funding or access funding to implement resiliency projects within their community. So there is the new DEC's funding finder tool to help simplify that process. You can select based on applicant, the project type, project phase, whether you're looking for, the initial planning and design of a project or construction and implementation. And then it'll output some grant programs that would be applicable to the type of project that you're looking for. There's also a recording of a webinar that was held called Navigating Grant Funding, Municipal Success Stories. So this is municipalities or other county or local entities that have found success with some of these grant programs, and it might provide you with some ideas for how you could implement similar projects in your community. There are a lot of resources available for this program. If you're looking for an all-encompassing guidance document, there's a FEMA 480, which is referred to as the Floodplain Manager's Desk Reference. We also have additional training available. We often partner with the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association, so additional training is available through them as well as on our website. There's independent study courses available through FEMA's Emergency Management Institute, and the National Association of State Floodplain Managers has developed an NFIP 101 course, which is a great reference guide or training resource if you're looking for some more information on that. All right, so with that, I guess we can open it up to any questions.
So as of right now, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but someone did ask about sharing the presentation. Even though we do have it recorded, Brianna, are you able to send your slides so we can access those resources?
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to send, Sarah, I can send you a PDF copy of the presentation as well that can be shared with anybody who attended and is looking for any of those links.
Okay.
Well, I guess if there's no questions, we can end the webinar. Okay, thank you, Sarah and Brianna and the attendees.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. If you do have any questions after, feel free to send me an email, or if you're not sure who to reach out to, again, you can always email our general email at floodplain@dec.ny.gov.
And I just wanted to make a reminder that for code credit to email Brianna or Sarah your ID number. And then for planning or zoning, Sarah should be in contact with certificate of attendance.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.